Hello, and welcome to this webinar presented by Mouser Electronics, Inc. and Anitian. Now allow me to introduce today's speaker, Andrew Plato, CEO of Anitian. Andrew, go right ahead.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for that introduction, Kim. I really appreciate it, and I want to thank Mouser Electronics and IEEE for putting on this webinar today. And I want to thank all of you who are listening this morning, afternoon, wherever you happen to be, for taking the time out of your day to talk about this topic. And today we are going to talk about how to think like a hacker. Specifically, how do hackers look at technology and systems and components and the things that you're building and designing right now today. So with that, I want to take a second. I want to introduce myself, tell you a little bit about me. I am a CEO after all, and I love talking about myself, right? So I'm the president and CEO of Anitian. Anitian is a cybersecurity intelligence firm. We've been doing security for 23 years. We're one of the oldest security firms really in the nation. Now, my history is I've done a lot of things in cybersecurity. I've done hacking, I've done penetration testing, I've done a lot of different things. But the root of my experience comes from I worked at Microsoft back in the mid-90s. And while I was working at Microsoft, one of my jobs there was to document databases, which incidentally is one of the most exciting jobs you can possibly have. I think it's like astronaut, daredevil, and then like documenting databases in the exciting job categories. I'm joking, obviously. So one day while I was documenting databases, I copy and paste the SQL query from a browser or from a tool that I was using into a browser window. I hit enter and it executed a query. What I had done, and I didn't know this at the time, is I had executed one of the world's first SQL injection attacks. I used that technique to hack a bunch of websites after that and got interested in the information security. But the more interesting thing I want to tell you about my background is when I went to the developers of the website I was working on at that time and I explained this to them, they were very dismissive of it. They didn't understand it. They didn't get it. They basically told me to shut up and go away. And so I mentioned that story because I think that's very relevant to what we're going to talk about today. There's a lot of things in security and hacking that when you hear them, it's easy to just kind of push them away and ignore them because of the discomfort that they may offer. I also want to mention on the line today, I also have another member of my team, that's Rick Osgood. He is actually one of our hackers here, and he's a white hat hacker, so he's one of the good guys. And he's going to be helping out and participating in the conversation today. So, Rick, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you for that.
All right. Okay. So, with that in mind, let's talk about the kill chain. I want to start with a common concept in hacking. We call it the kill chain, but specifically I want to talk about sort of some of the statistics and numbers and kind of what we know about hacking and how systems get into, how they get into systems. So one of the first and probably the most important statistics that everybody needs to understand is dwell time. So one of the things about hackers and all these breaches and everything you read about in the paper is that they don't happen instantaneously. These attacks take time, and hackers actually can dwell in an environment or be persistent in an environment for a very long time. If you look at Target, for example, the big Target breach that happened a few years ago, hackers were in that environment for well over 90 days. They actually hacked into systems and were persistent in the environment. This dwell time value is important because this means you have time as an engineer, as a designer. You have time to catch the hackers in the act. If you design your systems knowing that they're going to try to gain persistence in the environment, you can detect that and try to stop them during that dwell time. Some other key statistics that are interesting, hackers are ultimately after credentials. If they have a legitimate username and password, then they're basically unstoppable. That's relevant for you as a designer because, of course, you need to protect those credentials. Malware is one of the most common tactics that's used today. So hackers will design specific malware, or typically they'll take malware out of the various marketplaces for vulnerabilities and attacks, and they will design them specifically to attack your particular product or a particular class of products. I would note the second most popular technique here is account hijacking. Remember what I said about credentials and how important they are to hackers. Third parties discover 71% of all attacks. What that means is that it's not the company who made a product, or it's not the user often who discovers the attack. Target, Anthem, all these big breaches you're reading about, in many cases, they found out about it from somebody else. And for your perspective, again, that's an opportunity to provide intelligence and insight to your customers in giving them information so that they can detect the attack before somebody else does. 2% of systems out on the internet are fully patched. Patching is one of the most simple things that you or anyone else can do to protect a system. And yet the grand majority, 90-some% here, are unprotected. It's a very simple thing to do. And again, this is from an engineering perspective, the ability to update, patch, close vulnerabilities is a critical component to preventing or at least discouraging hackers from breaking into a system. Crime is the ultimate goal of pretty much most of the hacking going on in the world today. Cyber espionage, I'd say, is increasing, and typically this is a form of industrial espionage, so hackers trying to steal information to provide back to whoever hired them to do that. Hacking pays. Everybody pays. You pay, I pay, and it pays the hackers. Hackers wouldn't do this if they couldn't make money off of it. So the reason all these breaches, the reason all this is happening, the reason hackers are targeting your systems that you're designing is because they're going to either use you to get to somebody else, or they're going to use your technology to get information that they can then ultimately either make money off of or they can sell to somebody else. And whether they're selling that to a state-sponsored or a criminal syndicate, another company, it kind of doesn't matter. But this is a lucrative field, and that's why there's so many hackers out there. So this is the classic kill chain. This is essentially how you'd map out your classic attack. And it starts with a reconnaissance stage. Hackers are going to scan. They're going to look for things. But you'll notice here that there's a phase here. There's like three kind of key things that happen in almost every major hack, which is there's some sort of initial attack. There's some sort of establishing of a presence in the environment or on the system or on the application. And then there's typically some form of escalation or lateral movement. This represents the ideal time for you as an engineer, as somebody designing software or components, to catch these attacks. This is the best place you can get them, stop them, and prevent it from going on. Because once you start to get down toward this escalation, this internal reconnaissance, it gets increasingly more difficult. Because remember, your adversary, this is a game to them, and they want to win this game, and they don't play by rules. Okay? You have rules you have to follow as a designer, as an engineer. They don't have rules, and they will break whatever rules they can. And more importantly, one of the rules they're going to break is they're going to blind you at any chance they can. So if you have systems or components or software or processes running to specifically design to prevent things, they're going to try and shut those off. They're going to try and blind them. They're going to try to overwhelm them with data, or they're going to hope that you're not going to see whatever they're up to. They're going to try and hide amongst normal data. So you want to try to catch them at these initial points, and you want to try to discourage any further action down the kill chain. Because once you get to this exfiltration, which you can think of exfiltration as they're either trying to take data out of the system, or that's the point where your system has now become a component in their attack. Once you get to that point, it's pretty much all over. And there's probably very little you can do at that point besides just clean up and figuring out what the issues are and getting rid of the intrusion in place. So with that in mind, I want to move on to the next section. And I want to talk about, and really the whole topic of this presentation, which is how do hackers look at things? And I want to start with what I think is probably the most important difference between developers, engineers, quite frankly, a lot of us, and how a hacker tends to look at systems in the world. So most of us on that engineering and development side, we kind of work in a list-based world. which is you have a list of things you have to get done, you have timelines, you have a workflow you have to follow, you have a software development lifecycle or an engineering controls. As I mentioned before, you have a lot of rules that govern kind of your development effort. And you have to kind of follow those rules. You have to follow a process. Many of you probably work in an environment where the engineering is highly, it's organized, it's managed, you have project managers, and that's a completely legitimate way to do things. I mean, that's how we engineer technology. That is not how a hacker works, though. A hacker works in more of a path-based approach. While you're sort of working through lists and kind of working down the burn chart of things you got to get done, hackers work more like, they work more like criminals, and that is that they're looking for weakness and they're going to keep exploring paths. They're going to keep going down a path until they find something that gives them access. So they're going to try a lot of different things, some of which may make no sense whatsoever, and then they're going to kind of go, okay, well, what does that do? Well, what does this do? What does that do? And I know Rick can attest to a lot of the hacking testing and red team testing he does. I mean, every one of his successful attacks that he's done, that's pretty much how it worked. He tried one thing, then he tried something else, then he tried another thing. And for a hacker, that's really exciting. That's fun because you like doing that. You like that process of kind of like, let's see what this does. All right, that it did that. Okay. Well, let's see if I poke it that way, what happens. So that process is really fundamental to the way a hacker sort of looks at things and approaches things. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the other things that hackers do when they look at your software, when they look at your components. One of the first things they're going to do is what I call sort of observe the obvious. When you're inside a development effort and you're developing or engineering something, it's really difficult to kind of step out beyond it and ask yourself, wait a minute, why is it doing that? How does it do that? That's exactly what a hacker is doing. They're looking at your product, your technology, your components, and they're saying, why did they do that? What's the reason? How does this work? They're observing the obvious, and then they're poking at it and testing it. And for a hacker, that's, like I said, that's very fun. For you to kind of get into that hacker mindset, you got to do the same thing. At some point, you got to step back and you got to say, wait a minute, why are we doing this? How does it go? You got to sort of observe it from a distance. And some companies actually will hire third parties to do this. In fact, that's something we do at Anitian, specifically because a third party isn't embedded in it, isn't sort of biased by their own involvement in the project. What you're ultimately doing here is what we call in consulting, or in my world, you're going 5 whys deep. That's a phrase we use for keep asking why. And at about 5 whys into the question, you'll start to get to truth and the reality. Why are we doing it this way? Why is that necessary? Why did we design it that way? Was there a better way to do this? The deeper you go down that, at some point you're going to discover some of those significant vulnerabilities and the truth behind it. The next step I would recommend is you got to kind of start imagining the worst and thinking about the worst possible scenario that your technology can be used. A more obvious example of that is if you have a product or a technology that's being deployed in a place like, I don't know, Florida, well, it's probably going to get hit by hurricanes, okay? That's not an unlikely occurrence. However, if it's only being deployed in, I don't know, Canada or Alaska, you're probably not going to have a lot of hurricanes. Now, that's an obvious example, but the key here is that are you thinking of those scenarios? And more importantly, are you thinking about how likely those scenarios are? First off, a hacker's certainly thinking about them, and they will use those scenarios, or at least create those scenarios. They're not going to create hurricanes, but they'll create certainly worst-case scenarios at any point they can to basically destabilize your technology or destabilize what you've built. As I like to say, hackers are going to kick you when you're down, okay? At the worst possible point, when your technology, when yours is supposed to be sort of doing what it's supposed to be doing, that's when a hacker will come in and kick you and take advantage of the system. I would warn you to be careful of what I call cascading failures with no response. Or another way to think of that is zombie scenarios. I joke about that because if you think about every zombie movie that's out there, right? It always is the same, right? Somebody gets bit, somebody else gets bit, and before you know it, society has collapsed, right? Well, that's kind of ludicrous because there would be some response. If the dead suddenly are rising, I think we'd do something about it, right? Okay? We wouldn't just go, the dead are rising. Well, I don't know what to do. Let's just, run to the hills. We'd do something about it, presumably. That funny little tactic, though, works for you too. You got to don't create scenarios that essentially require this subsequent set of failures that nobody would ever do anything about, because typically that won't happen. That's fairly rare. How are you going to access your technology? I mean, every conceivable way you can access your technology. Physical ports, any kind of buses, any kind of debugging capabilities that are built into it, any kind of network access of any kind, Ethernet ports, Bluetooth, I don't care. Because I guarantee you a hacker is going to try every conceivable interface that you have on your device. If you put an interface on it, they will try it. They will beat on it. They will pound on it. Okay? You have buttons to reset it, they're going to push them. And they're going to keep pushing them. Because that's what hackers do. We like to pound on things and see how we can get into them. Ultimately, though, what a hacker really wants to get is some data. Because if data storage of any kind, flash memory, hard drives, doesn't really matter what the storage mechanism is, that is how you gain persistence in an organization. Remember what I said before, persistence, dwell time. It's a critical component of breaking into something. You got to get in and you got to gain some level of persistence. If you store or access data with your technology, with the components you're building, you need to know every conceivable little bit of data that you store. Where is it stored? How do you store it? Where is it used? How is it used? Where is it sent? How is it sent? All of that is critical because a hacker, if you store anything, they're going to find it and they're going to pound on it. They're going to look at it. Hash files, for example, password hash files. You can get those off of a system. You can take them offline. You can crack them. You can run them against a cracker. If your passwords are only 6 characters long, that isn't that difficult to crack, depending on how it's hashed and whether you use salts and other things. The point is that this data of any kind, regardless of whether you think that data is important or not, that is something a hacker is going to focus on intensely. And if they can get access to it, all the better. Humans are weak. I don't think I'm saying anything that's surprising here, and I'm not making a general statement on society and culture here. I'm just stating a reality of being human. We are a weak link in information security. Most, if not all, information security ultimately boils down to human weakness of some way, shape, or form. Okay? When you're engineering a product, you've got to remember that any time a human is going to interact with this technology, that's a weak point. User interfaces are just the most classic and egregious example here. If you have a user interface of any kind, and you have like a web server embedded in your app of any kind, that is something that hackers are going to just absolutely mercilessly pound because it's a weak point. And those points have to be designed for humans to use them, and therefore they often provide an innumerable number of ways to hack into things. More importantly, if humans have to interact with your technology, it's important to understand that humans are inconsistent. They're going to enter things wrong. They're going to do things wrong, all sorts of other things. That's why you have to do things like validating your inputs or parameterizing inputs to avoid that SQL injection error right there. These kinds of things not only prevent a human from accidentally hacking your system, but of course are going to help prevent attacks from people who actually do want to attack your system. There is probably a lot of information out on the internet about the technologies you're designing, and you'd be surprised what's out there. One of the things about hackers that you learn is they love to accumulate information. This is like a scavenger hunt for them, or this is a game, and they will find the most obscure pieces of information and use them as clues on how to hack you. Maybe there's a picture of a circuit board you designed out there on the internet that you posted on Facebook. That picture could become the clue a hacker uses to crack into your system. So you can't always control what's out there on the internet to some extent. What you can do, though, is at least be aware of it, because if you know what's out there, you know what the hackers are going to know. Because when we try to break into things, it's one of the first things we do is we go out and we go, all right, what can you tell us about this company or this product? And a lot of times the information we need, it's just lying out there on some news group or some article or some picture or some Pinterest posting. There's a lot of good tools you can use to scan for this kind of information. One of them is OSN. There's other companies that will provide this. But just knowing what's out there will help you get ahead of that threat. Mr. Potato Head. So I'm probably dating myself here with this reference, but how many of you saw War Games back in the 80s? For me, at my age, it's that was a great movie. For some of us, that's actually what got us into computer security. So there's a great scene in this movie, right about in the middle of the movie, where Matthew Broderick, who plays the kid, right, he goes and talks to these two computer engineers, these two nerdy guys, and the nerdy kid in the back says, he talks about a back door. And then the guy in the front, the guy with the beard here, he says, Mr. Potato Head, back doors are not a secret. and it sets up this whole scene. It's pretty funny. Here's the point. Back doors are not a secret. If you put a back door in your application, it's going to get found. People are going to know about it, whether you like it or not. You might think it's the most ultra super dark secret thing ever out there. It'll get found, and it'll get pounded on. And if it has a simple, remember, that's how Matthew Broderick got into the Whopper machine, right? They're as old as can be, and they're still out there, and they're still incredibly effective. The target breach, actually, one of the key components of that breach was that the hackers got in on a back door on an HVAC system. They found information about this back door out on the internet, and they tried it, and that got them in, and that allowed them to gain persistence in the environment, and then they escalated their privileges, and then there they went. So back doors, they're as old as war games, and they're still very effective. How many of you remember Heartbleed from a few years ago? Heartbleed was a huge, huge vulnerability that came out, and it was for the OpenSSL implementation, and it was a flaw in how it sends communications back. Here's a key thing about this. OpenSSL is in like everything, all right? It's one of those third-party open source components that like everybody in the universe has implemented. There's literally billions of implementations of OpenSSL, which means this one vulnerability, Heartbleed, created a humongous surface area of attack for hackers. There was one vulnerability, millions, if not billions of opportunities, of which there were a lot of attacks based on that. This illustrates one of the more crucial problems in design and development work these days, which is the use of third-party components. You might care greatly about the security of your product and the engineering, and you might be doing things as diligently as possible, but the third-party components that you're using, they might not care at all. And hackers are delighted to exploit your product because one of your third-party providers didn't care about security. Here's the important thing to remember. The security of your technology, the product you're building, is dependent upon all those third parties, whether you like it or not. And I guarantee you, if there is a serious break-in or attack, and if your product is the linchpin in an attack, those third parties are going to suddenly not return your phone calls, okay? They're not going to talk to you. So the onus is on you to ensure that not only are these third-party components integrated and implemented correctly, but that you have taken the time to figure out how to secure them in the environment. In our world and the type of testing we do, I mean, one of the most common ways we break into things is exploiting third-party components. WordPress, for example, and I know a lot of you are designing embedded components. You probably don't have WordPress running on them, but in the website world and the SaaS world, you got a lot of WordPress sites out there, and it's a really great example of how people will build these sites, download these third-party components from God only knows where, and these things are just riddled with vulnerabilities, weaknesses, poor implementations. Third-party technologies components represent a very significant risk to your product, so you need to pay attention to the security of them. Remember that hackers ultimately want some credentials here. They're ultimately after usernames and passwords, because once you have a username or password, you can pretty much do whatever you want. And I know, again, a lot of the attacks we do, this is the thing we go after. And once we've got that password, we can do anything. Sometimes they'll actually break into systems. And Rick, I know you remember doing this. They'll break in and they'll create their own accounts. They'll create their own access to things and then use those accounts to get in and do things. So you need to understand, what are all the users you have? What are all the rights they have? And more importantly, users should never have any more rights than they need. Okay, there should be no, as we like to say, discretionary access to anything, ever. Because if they have that access, again, a hacker is going to use it. Credentials of any kind, encryption keys too, are the holy grail for an intrusion. And lastly, our last sort of component in this thinking like a hacker is the sort of garbage in, garbage out problem. If your technology is part of a larger whole, then one of the simplest ways to sort of create a hack is to blind you, is to DDoS you, or to feed it false information. And again, this is another tactic that hackers will use. They'll sort of observe how your system does things, what its purpose is. Let's say, for example, again, you have a control system and it's providing, access and it's controlling different components and such. If I, as the hacker, can feed that false information and get that control system to go do something else, I could potentially create all manner of havoc. That's exactly the fear a lot of us have about industrial control systems and the Internet of Things type technologies, because it isn't just that they can be broken into and you can use them to, steal bitcoins or whatever. It's that they could be fed false information, or in a time of crisis, they could be blinded. They could be just denial of service. So you can imagine if you are the manufacturer of an industrial control component for, let's say, a nuclear power plant or something, you represent a potentially humongous risk to the whole here. So that becomes part of this question of how is information fed to your product, or how does your product interact with things? What happens if it becomes overloaded? Could it be overloaded? Is that even possible? Are there ways to sort of filter out noise? And if there and denial of service attacks are one of the most difficult, if not impossible, attacks to prevent, because you're dependent on basically all these upstream other technologies to prevent that attack sometimes. Denial of service is also a very effective technique. That's why you see a lot of it out there. Okay, so that's how to think like a hacker. Now you've got some of those good ideas about how a hacker is going to look at your product. Now let's kind of reverse everything and say, all right, I get it. They can break into my systems. I need to engineer better embedded systems here. So what do we do? So in this next section, I want to talk about how you're going to kind of hack your product development processes, how you can start to improve the development and the engineering phases to start integrating security and security testing and other things into all of the various development pieces. So let's start with the most simple and most straightforward thing that all of you should be doing at some level, and this is doing a risk assessment. The best security you can ever have is security based on the management of risk. Risk is kind of one of these concepts that all of us understand and we always talk about, but we don't necessarily always use it correctly. If you perform a solid, good risk assessment on your environment or your product, you can start to focus your efforts. And a risk assessment is really, it's in some ways, it's a very difficult and complicated thing. In some ways, it's a fairly straightforward thing. It starts with kind of asking some of those big open-ended questions. What are some of the bad things that could happen here? We make an embedded control system for railroads. What's some of the bad things that could happen to us? Well, somebody could break in and do this. We could get affected by malware. The number of bad things that could happen to that product is relatively finite. There may only be a few dozen of those that are really relevant to you. So then you can ask yourself, well, how likely are those to happen? How bad would it be if they happen? And then what could we have done to prevent that? That is, at the most basic level, a risk assessment. And you can use that to focus your efforts in security. if you base all of your security on the management of risk, you will ultimately have a more effective security system, controls, program, etc. And it's important to understand that you essentially have three responses to any risk or threat that you face. And that is, you can mitigate it, either eliminate it, put controls around it, train people on how to not create whatever the scenario is that would allow the attacker in. You could transfer that risk to somebody else. That might sound like a great thing to do, but that has risk in and of itself. When you transfer risk, you do something like you buy insurance for it, or you transfer that to the customer, or you transfer that to the implementer of your technology. You say, look, we can't fix this. This isn't our problem, so we need to transfer this risk to the end user, and we need to explain to them that they're at risk here. So transferring is a process where you're not necessarily getting rid of the threat or the problem. You're just making somebody else deal with it. And then, of course, the last thing you can always do is just accept it and say, well, there's really nothing we can do here. And some threats, there really isn't anything you can do anything about. Hurricanes being a good example of that. You're not going to stop hurricanes. And if you can, you probably should be doing something other than embedded systems, because that's pretty amazing if you can stop a hurricane. You want to focus on mitigating those most serious threats. The next step you can start doing is just aggressively testing everything. And at every conceivable phase, you need to have an aggressive security testing program and regimen. In the design phase, you should be doing independent security reviews, even if that's a member of your team. Assigning somebody to the team to just basically think about security in the design realm. As you're doing development, you should be scanning your code. There's a lot of great tools out there you can use to scan code. There's a lot of other testing tools you can get. You should be doing that continuously during the development phase, particularly if you're implementing any kind of third-party component. If you're going to implement another person's component, then you need to test that. You need to scan it. You need to scan it specifically for security issues. Once you get a finished product or a beta, or you have something that's ready for user testing or unit testing, then you need to start doing more aggressive kind of real-world tests. This would be things like penetration tests, web application tests, code scanning, social engineering, if that's relevant to your product. Some kind of real-world test. Another one we do is a red team testing, where you actually put a component in sort of a live environment, and then you let an attacker, a white hat hacker, somebody like Anitian or other companies will do that. You basically say, okay, go at it and try to break into it. That'll give you a lot of valuable information about how it's ultimately used. And then when you do finally put it into production and you do have living versions, then you can also continue doing red team and other kinds of real-world testing. This testing that you do might seem like an onerous kind of thing to do, but it is going to save you a lot in the security, because this is how we can discover those vulnerabilities. When we do penetration testing, we run scans, we often find a whole sequence of vulnerabilities to exploit. And at that point, it really just becomes all right, well, which one are we going to exploit today? So the more you can do to limit that information, the more you can know that ahead of time and then mitigate that, it's just going to put you in a much, much stronger position when you ultimately go to production. Your development lifecycle, whether it's a software development lifecycle, whether it's an engineering program, you really kind of need to round it out and add some security to it. So first thing, and some of these bullets are some very simple things you can do. You may be already doing a lot of them. In fact, if you have a well-organized engineering department, you probably already have a lot of these. But there's probably a few you could still add. Storing your code securely. I was involved in a really big acquisition of a company a few years ago. And one of the things that really caught me about this company was that they were really, really good at securing their code, because they had developers all over the world working and collaborating together. And their code, because it was a security technology, if it had leaked out, it could have irreparably damaged their brand. And so they spent a lot of effort and time to really, really tighten down all the controls around their code. It really served them well, and it was an excellent, it gave the company value too, I might add. It was one of the things I noted in my analysis of that company. Controlling that design and development process is important. And you want to be able to share openly. You want to be able to, collaborate with a lot of people. But doing that in a secure way where you can validate people, where you use secure code storage, you use things like multi-factor authentication, this is going to have a lot of value because it's going to make sure that the code, the designs, the information about your app doesn't leak out into the public. I mentioned before, third-party component reviews. I can't stress how important that is. I know I've brought it up multiple times, and I'm going to keep bringing it up. Security awareness training. There's a lot of great companies out there who can do security training for developers. We work with a company that offers a great online course. There's SANS. There's a number of different organizations. Just going to training, even if you already know all the stuff they're talking about, even if it seems rote to you, the practice and the process of going to training on a regular basis will kind of remind you and put you back into that mindset of, oh yeah, that's right, we can't do that, we got to be careful about that. So security awareness training has value beyond just teaching you the steps of security. Not mixing up your test data and production data. It might seem like a small thing, but you'd be surprised how many test systems that we evaluate where there's production data, or how many production systems where there's test data. Using secure coding standards. So there's a number of secure coding standards out there. There's some specifically for embedded systems, this MRSA-C, for example. Those standards give you a ready-made kind of template of how to do things. Now, that's a good starting point. You still need to test, you still need to do some of these other things, but when you use those standards and you conform to them as best you can, it simply means that you're going to be following well-known good practices that other people are using. So anytime you can find and use those and adopt those, and many of the component providers will actually have those standards for you. And if they don't, you should ask them why they don't. While you're developing and designing your system, it's important to think about agility versus strength. So one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make in security is this kind of castle mentality. And it's this notion that, well, if we build a big enough wall, we'll keep everybody out. I'm going to tell you that there is no wall you can build that will keep people out or hackers out. It doesn't matter how high the wall is. It doesn't matter how thick the wall is. It doesn't matter how radioactive the wall is. Walls don't protect you. I know that's, might sound like a statement you read on Facebook, but it's very true in information security. It's not the size of your wall or the size of your controls that's going to protect you. It's the agility of your system. It's your ability to move or change or shift out of place when you're getting attacked. There's a great quote from a movie I like where I use this, and I have it right here. It's actually from the new Rocky movie a few years ago. And Rocky says to I believe it's his son actually, he says, it's not about how hard you can hit, it's how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. So that principle really is important. And when you're designing your systems, when you're designing these components, you should be thinking about how can I make this as agile as possible? Let's imagine I was getting attacked. How could I update it really quickly? How could I get information out to users fast? How could I, in the matter of minutes or hours or days, react to that attack? And this is an area where the cloud and open APIs and things like that can be really useful because they create agility. Now, of course, they also create an avenue of attack, so you've got to think about ways to protect those. But the more agile your applications, your components, your pieces, the more you can maneuver, the more likely you're going to be able to withstand an attack. Because when you see the attack, you can do something about it. If your system is completely, never can be changed, is never, is one thing and it's always, that sort of monolithic sort of design is actually weaker in many ways. Next step I would remind you is just kind of keep everything clean. Keep a clean workspace here. And these are some of these sort of basic good security ideas. Validate data as it goes in and out. It's parameterize your inputs, as we like to say, right? Don't allow unvalidated data. No discretionary access. No untrusted anything ever running. If you've got apps running on your components, you should know exactly what they are. You should have it trusted. You should sign them. You should have checksums built into the system. Any kind of remote access should be as absolutely limited as possible. Understand that many times you need that. Avoiding any kind of system-wide secrets. This is one of those sort of like odd little engineering things, but compartmentalize things as best you can. This is where kind of microservices and other things kind of come into play, is creating sort of compartmentalization so that if somebody is able to hack into one compartment, then they have to figure out how to hack into the next compartment. The more compartmentalized your systems are, and the more you don't share like a secret key or encryption across the entire system, the more difficult it is going to be to hack your system, the more difficult it is to be able to get information out of it. If there's no reason why something is in your product, if it really is just there for, it looks nice or it made somebody feel good, then you really should get rid of it. Unnecessary components often are the source of a lot of attacks. This is why backdoors are a problem, quite frankly. If you don't need it, get rid of it. Your components, your systems, your applications, they really need to do as absolutely little as possible, okay? And I understand your engineering managers and your marketing people might not want to hear that, right? They're like, what do you mean it's supposed to do as little as possible? What we mean by that is that there should really be nothing discretionary in there. If you have a future, this is for future use, great. Then it shouldn't be there, or it shouldn't be available or accessible in any way, shape, or form. Embrace the cloud. The cloud is really your friend. And there's this kind of myth about the cloud, that the cloud is insecure, it's not as safe, you have no privacy. A lot of that just isn't true, although the privacy thing, maybe not so sure about that one. But 97% of companies at this point have some or all of their infrastructure in the cloud. The cloud's the future. It's where everything is going. The thing is, it's more agile, it's more flexible, and ultimately, it's really more secure. Cloud-deployed environments are fundamentally more secure. Now, in your case, designing embedded systems, you can use the cloud as really a coordination point. This allows you to use it to gather data, use it as a point to log information, publish APIs, interact with your components in the field, centralize coding and development work. The cloud is your friend, and you should embrace it pretty much at any point you can. First off, it's just where things are going. But secondly, you can do security in the cloud easier than you can do security elsewhere. There's a lot of automation. There's a lot of capabilities the cloud offers by default that means you don't have to go out and buy a bunch of software or technology, because the security controls and pieces you need are already there. One of the last things I would encourage all of you to do is, this is a trend we're starting to see in technology as a whole. And I like to call it disposable tech, or disposable IT. Your technology, what you're designing, literally should be disposable. What we mean by that in a security perspective is, one of the greatest sort of security controls you can have is the ability to reset and start over at a moment's notice. That persistence problem. Hackers need persistence in your technology, and anything you can do to break that persistence issue works in your favor. This is where disposability comes into play. So one of the things we are really pushing a lot of customers, we work with a lot of companies on, is helping them build environments where literally at a moment's notice they can reset everything back to default, reload user data, and you're good to go. You're essentially not dependent on any kind of long-term persistence on your system. And when you reload and you reset, you basically go back to a protected golden firmware image, or a protected image or configuration that is accessible to exactly nobody, and you can get right back into kind of a default state. And then you automatically reconfigure it with the user data. That means storing that data separate from the system. You automate that entire process. So what you're essentially doing is giving your users the ability to say, I think we've been hacked, let's push a button and reset it and set it all over. If you can do that, if your technology can do that, and incidentally, the cloud is a great way to coordinate that activity, okay? If you can automate that, if you can automate the ability to set up, configure, reset your products, you can stop, prevent, and avoid a huge swath of attack tactics. Now, that doesn't make your system completely secure. What it does is it makes you a lot more agile. If there is an attack in place, it allows you, it allows your users, it allows the customers, it allows everybody to say, we're just going to start over and reload from scratch. And it will kill that persistence that the hacker has in the environment. One of the customers we work with, for example, they have a completely automated cloud environment. Every week, and it's Sunday morning or something, they completely, and it's totally automated, their entire environment is rebuilt. So they set up new systems, they automatically configure them, they copy over all the user data, all the important data. Everything gets reconfigured in an automated fashion. They repoint all the DNS records and everything. And within this matter of an hour or two, they've completely replaced their entire infrastructure, and then they blow away the original infrastructure. And then they just keep redoing that every week. By doing that, hackers are never able to gather any kind of persistence in their environment, really. And the benefits to them are just huge because of that. So disposable technology works in your favor. Now, you might think, well, wait a minute, how am I going to do that in an embedded system? Well, there you go. There's your challenge for this. How do you do that? How do you reset? How do you break that persistence that the kill chain and the hackers are really after? Okay. So with that, and we are at, looks like we've got about 10 minutes remaining here. So this would be a good chance. I'd be happy to take some questions. It looks like we have gotten a few questions here. So let's start. Let's start with, let's see, this one. Do you see a big potential for the emergence of the next Microsoft or Apple in cybersecurity as threats increase in frequency and danger? That's an interesting question. Here's what I think you mean by that. So I'm gonna take a swipe at sort of answering that. Is there going to become sort of the giant, titans of cybersecurity that are going to kind of dominate the landscape? Possible, and you've already got a few that are probably pretty close. Symantec comes to mind. Cisco comes to mind. Here's the thing, though, about security, and particularly the security market that's different. And we're kind of veering off the engineering side into more of a market thing. Security does not have the kind of scalability and returns that product development does. The reason Microsoft and Apple are so big is because they can design product once and they can sell it 1 billion times over, right? There's one iPhone 8 design. Well, I guess there's two technically, right? The little one and the big one. But there's two basic designs and they sell 1 billion of them. Okay, that allows them to have immense scale. Security doesn't quite work that way. You just don't have that kind of scale. So it's difficult to scale that to a point where you can get to a Microsoft or Apple-style company. No is what I'd say. I don't think you're ever going to get to that level of tight. What you're going to end up having is security is something that really needs to be disseminated amongst everybody. Everybody needs to deal with security. And while there might be specialists and products and sort of providers of that, we all need to be taking security seriously. Okay, so next question. Let's see, what's this one? Do you expect an increased demand in security professionals as 5G emerges in a few years' time? We expect an increase in demand for security professionals, period. 5G is only going to moderately affect that. And I assume when you're talking about 5G, you're referring to the new cell phone, faster sort of cell access. That's what I assume you're talking about. And if I'm wrong, correct me. speed on the internet is only just allows things to go, anytime you have a higher degree of bandwidth or speed or performance, it just allows hackers to do more and do them faster and run through more scenarios in a quicker way, okay? The fact that this is going to extend to cell phones, yes, I could see that that could increase attacks against mobile devices, but attacks against mobile devices have been going up for years. So there's an increased need for cybersecurity professionals, period, across the board. There's something on the order of a couple million unfilled positions in this field. So this is an exciting field. Those of us who've been in it a long time, we love it. It's exciting. And what I would say is if you have any interest in it, get into it. So, okay, let's see. Next question. Oh, we got a lot of questions here. Where is the best place to start for a just graduated computer engineer to get into the industry? I assume you're talking about security industry. So this is a question of security people get asked a lot. How do I get into the industry? How do I get into information security? Here's what I tell you. Go get an IT job. Go get a job running systems, networks. Go get a job doing computer work of any kind. Don't get a security job. Get a job with hands-on technology experience. An IT help desk is a great place to start. If you can get in as a network admin or a system admin, some sort of an engineer, I'd be wary of development because developers, I think, often have a difficult time transitioning into security. You need to be doing an operational role. And the reason I say that is because security is ultimately somewhat of an operational component of any network system or design effort. So if you can get that hands-on skill, when we recruit security people, we recruit out of IT positions. We don't generally recruit out of development jobs, but we can. Developers tend to wind up on more of the hacking side, on more of like the testing side, than they would on just the pure play sort of security side. So that would be my advice to all of you is go out, get a hands-on technology job. Anything you can get is helpful there. Okay, let's see. Let's see if we got another good question here. All right, here's a great question. We have thousands of devices deployed. There is no way somebody could go around and patch them all. How do you deal with this? Well, that's a good one. That's a really good one. Okay, that is a big problem. How do you deal with thousands or millions of devices when it's inconceivable for anybody to go around and patch them? You're right, that's bad. Here's the first thing. Ideally, you want to engineer things so that you can go around and patch them. This is where I mentioned that use the cloud to coordinate activities, have some sort of capability to patch things. But I get it. Some embedded systems, some technologies, it just isn't feasible in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so how are you going to wall this thing off? Assuming that if you deploy this piece of technology, this component, this whatever it is, into the world, and there is a vulnerability on it, which there probably is. No matter how well you've engineered it, there's a good chance there's a vulnerability to it. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with the fact that that could get hacked, could get used? The answer really is one of you have to figure out how to kind of wall that system off. You have to figure out how to make it so if that vulnerability, if it was exploited, you can break that persistence, that kill chain. And if you can't patch it, fine. Remember, patching is the easiest thing you do. But if you can't patch it, then you got to figure out another technique to kind of get around that and to break that persistence chain, whether that's through rebooting, whether that's through re-imaging, whether that's through some sort of checksum, whether that's whatever it has to be. If it's not feasible, then you've got to design another mechanism around it, some sort of other control mechanism. Or you've got to eliminate all the other avenues that you could get in and exploit those vulnerabilities, things like access, things like user interface issues, whatever you can eliminate. Think about it this way. When attackers are going to attack your system, they're ultimately, this is a surface area, right? The bigger that area is, the more things they can attack, the more opportunities you give them. And so if you're not able to patch, then you have to kind of lower the surface area on all the other things out there. Okay, let's see if we've got any other good questions here. Rick, did you want to add anything to that last one, by the way?
The only thing, maybe if you can prioritize, right? If you've got millions of devices, but some of them are at higher risk, or they're controlling more. They could have a bigger impact, right? If they're attacked or breached, you would probably want to focus on those first, other than devices that are at lower risk, or maybe they're inaccessible via the internet or whatever it may be. You can at least prioritize them.
It's good advice. Okay, here's a good question. And it's a very simple question. How do we know our controls are actually working to prevent an attack or a breach? Excellent question. Well, first off, there's a number of things you can do. But it starts really with testing. Anytime you can test those controls in a real-world scenario, the better. So this is where things like pen testing, social engineering, code review, all these kind of testing capabilities come into play. When you fully built your app, your component, get it into a real-world situation, and then get somebody else who's not involved with the development. This is a key thing. Remember that whole bias thing? When you're inside the middle of development, you have an inherent bias. It's difficult, if not impossible, to be objective when you have actually developed something. So find somebody else, whether you hire a third party, which is what I would encourage, of course, or just somebody else in your organization. But find an objective third party who can test that system in a real-world scenario. How would they break in? Let them go at it. First off, if you have those controls, then their efforts should be obvious. If you have access controls and they keep trying to break into the username or password, you should see evidence of that, whether it be through logs or through locking them out or something like that. Testing kind of all those vulnerabilities, all those paths. How do you get to the data? What happens if you do? The person does just rip it off the wall and go and looks at it. Test the social engineering components of it. Is there some sort of password reset? Is there some sort of user? Do you have like a help desk or something like that? These are all the different avenues that an attacker is going to take. The controls you have, no matter how well you design and engineer them, they're not going to be any good unless you test them. And this is true of for all of you who are in engineering, you could design the greatest thing in the world. You got to test it. Security is no different. You can design the best security in the world, but you got to be able to test it. And it's got to be able to stand up to attack. Okay, in our last few minutes here, let's see if we have any other. Who is the company that rebuilt that system weekly? Love to tell you that. Unfortunately, I'm sure somebody would. I'm sure somebody would sue us if I told you that. So, unfortunately, I can't tell you that. So, all right, let's see. We got a couple of other quick questions. You said IT is the best place to start on the defensive side of security. Do you have any advice to a recent grad looking into the offensive side of security? Oh, that's a tricky question. Let me warn you that the offensive side of security, what you're really talking about is pen testing, and you're talking. I would still say working in IT is an excellent place to start. So again,
I'd agree with
the
that.
best pen testers I know, Rick being one of them. Rick is like the best pen tester in the world. He started in IT. Okay. Everybody here who's done hacking has started in IT. And the reason I say that that's important is because you got to understand how systems work at a operational level. You got to know how they not only work, but how they're actually used and implemented. So, you want to be a pen tester, go get an IT job. Software engineering and coding is going to help you too in pen testing. It'll certainly won't hurt you.
I think if you get into web app testing, I think if you go development, if you want to get into web app testing, that would probably be help you significantly on that side of things.
Right. I agree.
Or work on bug bounties, right? If maybe you're working on the defense side in IT for a while to get that base level experience, but in the meantime, in your free time, you can be working on bug bounties or go to a place like VulnHub, download vulnerable virtual machines and hack them and actually do that stuff in your free time and sort of build a portfolio of work and a body of offensive knowledge while you're gaining the the corporate level IT experience. So you kind of can do both at once.
Yes, couldn't agree more. Pen testing is fun too. I am sure Rick will attest to that. It's a very enjoyable thing to do, and and so yes, getting into IT and then doing kind of those bug bounties are a really good way to kind of hone your skills and get challenged in doing that. So one last quick question. We're really at the end of our time here. So is when your hardware relies on the cloud, what are some of the important security aspects to address, i.e. transport security? Cloud security is almost a whole other presentation in itself, so I'm not going to go too deep into that. What I will say is that transport security is, yes, encrypted traffic. Encrypting the traffic, having protections on either side. Here's the thing I really want you to hear about this. The cloud, and I'm talking like AWS and Azure, they have a lot of those capabilities built right into the platform. You get them by default. So secure remote access is built right into those platforms. Secure API access and filter lists and controls and firewalls and all these things are built right in. Amazon and AWS offers a key management system that frankly is excellent. So if you're doing any kind of encryption of any kind, you can use their systems just by default by having an AWS account. So we're at the end of our time, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time today for listening to me and Rick and all of us. I want to thank Mauser for putting this on. And letting us have the opportunity to talk to all of you. And of course, if you'd like to ask any further questions, please feel free to reach out to myself. And I believe my contact information is on one of these slides coming up here in just a second. Here it is. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to continue to answer questions. You can, of course, continue to answer questions, ask questions through this, and we will get them answered afterwards. Again, thank you, everybody, for the time today. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great day.